Welcome to Season 3 of the Guardians of Hope podcast. We are a community of parents, educators, health, legal, and tech experts dedicated to positively impacting children's lives. The thoughts and opinions of my guests are not my own. This is a platform for sharing. Welcome, everyone. Your parent has been diagnosed with a terminal illness, or a beloved family member has died suddenly, and your child is watching, listening, asking questions that you don't know how to answer. Most parents freeze in this situation because we've been taught not to talk about death, especially with children. So we use euphemisms like grandma went to sleep, we lost grandpa, we avoid the conversation entirely, or we shield kids from grief thinking we're protecting them. But what we're actually doing is leaving them confused, frightened, and unprepared for one of life's most inevitable experiences. Today, we're joined by Dr. El-Risi Doc, a thanatologist, death educator, and certified grief educator trained by David Kessler. As department chair and professor of thanatology at Capstone University and incoming president of the National Home Funeral Alliance, Dr. Doc has dedicated her career to breaking the cultural silence around death, dying, and bereavement. Dr. Doc, welcome. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for having me, Cynthia. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. So why don't we learn more about your background? How did you get into this line of work?
So initially, I was studying clinical psychology because I had the intention of becoming a grief counselor. And I always kind of felt like there was a missing piece to that educational process. And so basically, one year while I was an undergrad, I decided to study the sociology of death and dying because a lot of the early sociologists actually created many of the theories that we use in thanatology. But in that experience, I learned about thanatology, and I started looking at not only the micro level of how death, dying, and bereavement impacts all of us, but also the macro level as to how it is essentially, permeating our society, how that influences our interactions, relationship dynamics, you name it. And I was also at a point in my career where I was really interested in behavioral health. And so to me, I think that mental health, how we experience life, our death adjacent experiences, and our personal loss experiences really influence, our day-to-day health outcomes ultimately. So I was looking for a way to sort of combine all of that and got into thanatology and started noticing different research gaps and figuring out where I could contribute in those respective areas.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad to have you here, Dr. Doc. So I have a lot of questions for you, and I want to get started right away. So thank you for sharing your experience with us. My first question is that most parents want to protect their children from pain. So, for example, when a grandparent passes away or death happens in the family, parents use euphemisms like so and so went to sleep or we lost them. Sometimes they avoid the conversation entirely. Does this help or harm children? And what can you tell us that children actually need from this experience when death enters their lives?
So that's a great question. I would say that using euphemisms ultimately is more harmful than anything else. It's our way of trying to shield children from the potential pain associated with grief and loss, as you've mentioned. But for a child, this is actually really confusing because when we say, grandpa went to sleep, what we're communicating to them is that sleep is dangerous. It's reversible. Grandpa can still come back and wake up at any moment, and that is not the reality. Similarly, when we say, we lost someone or we lost grandpa, a child's immediate reaction to that is going to be like, well, let's go find him, where'd he go? And so it's really important to be honest with them, within the context of what their developmental stages are at the time, because it's not only validating their reality, but it's giving them the permission to feel whatever they're feeling at that time. Is it sadness? Is it confusion? Is it curiosity? Um, and it also teaches something very important, which I think is that the reality is of death is not so terrible that we cannot speak about it. Um, so I would recommend being completely honest with them, and this is going to vary, but what you could say is grandpa died, his body stopped working, um, he's not going to come back, and it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling.
Yeah. That I think what you just said right there, his body stopped working, I think makes so much sense and resonates with a lot of children. But we're going to go into the ages and break down how to communicate. So, for example, a 4-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a teenager all understand death differently. What would help is if you could walk parents through developmentally appropriate ways to talk to children about death at different ages, like what language they should use, concepts, examples like that.
Okay. So at 4 years old, children have pretty much what is known as magical thinking. They have the perception that thoughts cause certain events to happen. So if they are mad at somebody, or if they've said something that might have caused, some sort of disagreement between them and the person from their perception, they blame themselves for things. Um, they believe, since they have magical thinking, that death is temporary, that you can reverse it, you can bring that person back. And so when you are explaining death to a 4-year-old, you need to give very simplified biological facts. Don't use any euphemisms, don't over explain. You can turn back to that initial statement of grandpa's body isn't working anymore, he died, etc. The reason why you don't want to over explain is because a lot of times, if you start over explaining and you provide too many details, they're either going to get confused or they're just going to keep having additional questions that are going to be too complicated to really answer for a 4-year-old.
Mhm.
Um, it's different though for a 10-year-old, because with a 10-year-old, they are at a stage where they are developing what is, I would say, abstract to concrete thinking. So they understand that death can be final, that it can be very personal. They understand that death is something that happens to everyone. And with this understanding of that aspect of finality, it can cause them anxiety. So now what's happening is when you are explaining that grandpa died, now they're starting to worry. Like, okay, grandpa died. Does that mean mom and dad are going to die? Does that mean my friends can die? And so
Mhm.
at that point, you really have to think about not only how to answer their questions, but how to do it in a way that's not going to cause them further anxiety. Sometimes what I find is that parents become really concerned, or rather, guardians, parents, caretakers, depending on the circumstances, they become very concerned because children at this age become very interested in death. They have a curiosity about it because it's an unknown to them. They only know that it's final. They don't know what happens during or, afterwards. And so a lot of those questions that you get become a little bit more difficult. And what I've found is that when you are talking with children at that age, it's okay to explain to them that you don't know everything. If they present you with a really difficult question and it's very complex and you don't know how to answer them at that age, you can say, you know what? I don't have the answer for that at the moment, but we can figure it out together. And that's when you can use some sort of educational, reference. And then finally, for teens, I would say that teens are probably leaning more towards concrete thinking. They tend to have more adult clarity, but at the same time, they are facing very intense emotions, mood swings, and invincibility. There's always this sort of feeling that teens have, like, nothing can happen to me. And so
Mhm.
death shows them that, yes, my friends can die, I can die. What does that mean for me and my future? If grandpa died, what does that mean for all the things that I wanted to share with grandpa that I can't do with him now? And so they are really at a stage of processing how loss changes their identity and their future. And you can sort of lean more into, I would say, more encouraging conversations with them. You know, you can say, I understand that you're having these emotions, and I'm
Mhm.
not going to force you to attend this event or, spend time with the family or whatever. You can talk to me whenever you're comfortable. And that kind of gives them the opportunity to set everything on their own pace.
Yeah. Thank you for breaking that down. Now let's talk about how you prepare children for a family member's death. How do you start those conversations about the reality of what's happening? And most importantly, I think for parents, how do you balance grief with supporting this communication to your children through their grief?
Mm. So, when someone you love has a terminal illness, um, a lot of times what you're going to experience is anticipatory grief. You're grieving before they've even died due to the circumstances. And when it comes to explaining this to children, I always think that it's better to start this conversation sooner than later because there's no benefit to waiting. And a lot of times, if you wait, the person's condition, depending on how degenerative it may be, is going to worsen and you're going to lose valuable time. So I would say, you need to be upfront with them. Children know that there's something wrong, but they don't always know what is wrong. And when they don't know what is wrong, their imaginations tend to fill in the gaps, and that can be worse than anything you would tell them in many instances. Um, it's important to understand that having these conversations, whether it's with a child or with a teen, is an ongoing process. It's not a moment of having this conversation and now we're at this understanding and everything is okay. It's a
Mhm.
continual conversation. So you have to filter that through their developmental lens. Um, and you have to be honest with them. So this can be like saying something along the lines of, mom or grandpa are very sick. Um, this is an illness that people usually don't get better from. Um, they are going to die at some point, but we don't know exactly when. And as I said, it's a process. So later on, as time is progressing, you can say, well, you see, she's becoming a bit weaker. So now she needs to rely on, a feeding tube or something along those lines so that they understand that this progression is happening and they can comprehend what is occurring visibly, right?
Mhm.
Um, and in doing that, you are also communicating to them that grief is survivable. Um, I would say that, the other key factor about this is that, um, when we are grieving, how we navigate that experience is being modeled to our children and to teens that are around us. So it's difficult because you have to navigate your own grief while they're grieving, but at the same time, it is an opportunity for a teachable moment ultimately.
Yeah. Now, what about after death occurs? Should a child see their dying or the body? Should they attend the funeral? I mean, this sounds like a common sense question, but for a lot of people, it's really not.
Mhm.
Um, can you help parents understand what's appropriate and what benefits children gain from the entire experience?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question because it's very common, and this is probably one of the most
Mhm.
common concerns that people approach me with, in regards to children. So I would say that, you know, as a society, we have attempted to sanitize death and to shield children. And when we do that, it is also shielding them from the meaning and the importance of being in community and, experiencing ritual both after someone has died and throughout the grieving process. Um, the common fear is that in exposing them to viewing the body or to attending the funeral or to even visiting while someone is in the hospital with a terminal illness, people are often concerned that they're going to traumatize the child. And the reality is that a lot of times the true trauma comes from being excluded from these experiences because children will blame themselves. They will feel resentment that they weren't asked to attend these events in their
Mhm.
loved one's life. Um, and so I do recommend it. I do say that it's important not to force a child because obviously if they don't want to do something and you force them, that can be traumatic. But if you're going to have them go to the hospital, for example, you can explain to them ahead of time so they know what to anticipate. Um, Grandpa's going to look different. His skin
Yeah.
might be a different color. When you touch him, he might be a little colder than usual. Mom is on a life support machine. The machines are helping her to breathe. Um, their eyes are closed, and it may seem like they can't respond, but they can still hear what you're saying. It's okay if you want to hold their hand. It's okay if you want to touch them. Things like that can be really helpful in a hospital setting. For a viewing, the same thing applies as well. Now, there are some people that are afraid of having their child view a dead body,
Mhm.
and I think that, you know, there is usually less trauma associated with that than one might imagine, as long as you prepare them for it, because what you are showing them is, "This is what mom looked like when she was alive. This is what mom looks like now that she's dead." You can
Yeah.
still touch her, you can say goodbye, you can have this moment to say whatever you want to say with her, and that helps them to process things. Um, and I think in regards to attending funerals, if you're going to bring a child to a funeral or a teenager, it's really great if you can give them a role or something to do in the funeral.
Mhm.
It gives them something that makes them feel like they are actively participating versus passively observing what's going on, which can really shape their experience and their attitudes surrounding death and dying. And it also kind of gives them a sense of belonging, which reinforces that importance of community in a death adjacent situation.
Yeah, that's a great tip. Thank you. Now, when a parent loses their own parent, or tragically, if they lose a child, a parent will be grieving heavily
Mhm.
and supporting a grieving child at the same time. What do parents need to understand about this, about a child's grief and how it differs from adult grief?
Mhm.
And this second question is, what are the signs to look out for if your child is struggling with the grief?
Mm. So, when we are grieving and when a child is grieving, um, this is a bit challenging because you are that child's emotional, social, psychological anchor in that moment. Like, you are the most familiar person they have in the face of loss. And you are also trying to process your own grief and deal with all of the emotions that are arising from it on your own, right? And so I think an important way to differentiate between a child's grief and an adult's grief is, I like to give the example of puddles and oceans. So a child's grief is like a puddle. There can be depth to it, but they can jump in and out of it. For them, it can be incredibly deep and incredibly intense at times, depending on the circumstances, but it's intermittent. They can do other things. Whereas for an adult, it's like an ocean. It's constant, it's heavy. You can't jump in and out of it that easily. You can feel very overwhelmed and feel like you are, struggling to keep up with everything. And so, in this regard, we have to understand that when children grieve, they sort of experience this in a way that we don't conceptualize as adults. They can be sad about grandpa dying, 10 minutes ago, and then they can go play with their friends, or they can go draw or play with Play-Doh, or you name it. Whereas
Mhm.
for us, we're ruminating on those thoughts about, "Oh, no, grandpa just died, like, he meant so much to me," et cetera, et cetera. Um, and so what I've found is children really need to know that what they're experiencing is okay, because again, we're an anchor for them. So you can say, like, "Hey, it's okay to play. If it's okay that you were sad, 10 minutes ago, and that you don't feel as sad right now, that doesn't mean anything bad about how you felt about grandpa or mom or whomever it was that died. It's okay to feel happy for a little while if that's what you feel like doing. It doesn't mean that you're always going to be happy, and it doesn't mean that you've forgotten grandpa or grandma. It just means that you are in the present living life. Uh, you can also kind of, on the flip side, reiterate to them that when they're having these moments of sadness that are so confusing for them, you
Mhm.
know, it doesn't mean that you're never going to laugh again. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to express these emotions and to share them with others. And so ultimately, what you're doing is you're teaching them that death and loss and grief are painful, but they are not going to absolutely destroy you. They're going
Mhm.
to be these pivotal moments in your life, and you are not going to forget them. And in many ways, you're going to carry them with you, but they are going to shape you, and it's not going to have a detrimental impact on your life or your future.
Mhm.
Um, and then the final thing I would say about that is, you know, children don't often, and this varies by age, but children don't often verbalize what they're feeling. A lot of times when they're struggling with grief, it comes out in their behaviors. They have outbursts, they start having difficulty keeping up with their academic performance, they experience, regressive behaviors, bedwetting, you name it. And so those are some key indicators that maybe there's something going on there that we need to explore a bit more with the child, because maybe they're just not verbalizing it, or maybe they are at a developmental stage where they can't verbalize those feelings. But the flip side of that is that when we're grieving, we go through a wide range of emotions, right? Frustration, anger, sadness, loneliness, you name it. And so there's going to be times when you're going to feel frustrated when you're interacting with children during this moment, There's going to be times when you are not going to feel like you have it all figured out and put together. And if you have a moment where snap at your child and you have an attitude, and you realize that this happened and you feel bad about it, it's okay. You're human. But at the same time, you can use that as a teachable moment for that child. You can hold space for them in that moment and say, "Hey, I reacted really poorly, and I'm sorry for that. The reason why I yelled, or the reason why I was snappy, is because I'm upset and I feel really sad that grandpa died. And
Mhm.
I didn't know how to manage those emotions at that time." So that teaches them that even if you were to have an outburst, you can come back from it and you can ground yourself.
Yeah. And what I'm getting through this whole conversation about talking to children about grief is this message that life may not be survivable, but grief is survivable. And that is something that we have to keep in mind. I love that. Thank you. All right. One more question for you. When parents, or for parents who haven't exactly gone through this, they haven't faced death in their family, but do know that it's coming,
Mhm.
through parents or a terminal diagnosis down the road. How do they prepare their children to talk about death proactively? I know you covered this a little bit, but I want this to be what we leave parents with today. Like, how do they prepare their children and talk about it proactively?
Hmm. So I would say, I'm a very keen supporter of death positivity in the context of being proactive about having these conversations. I think that, just as we want our children and the children around us to uh, be proactive about living and to have a passion for life, we also have to weave the reality of death and grief into our daily interactions, because ultimately this helps us to um, not only develop a healthy relationship with mortality independently, but also to model that relationship with mortality to children. And so, what I've found to be pretty successful with children is to find examples in your day to day life of life and death. This can be a leaf falling during autumn and it's changing colors and it's crunchy now that it's fallen from the tree because it's lost its life source, right? It can
Hmm.
be a flower that's wilting. It can be a dead bug that you found, when you were on your walk. Um, and you can use this as an opportunity to say, like, this is what it looked like when it was alive. This is what it looks like dead. Um, this is a natural biological process. It's present not only across human beings, but animals and plants and so many different aspects of nature, right? And that can sort of help them to just get a general conceptualization of life and death. I think another great option is to read stories to children. Read stories that include explanations about death and grief and loss. And this is important because these stories are usually, I would say, they're packaged in what I would call a container. And a container is something that is a safe space. It's a fictional space that is not going to directly impact them in the real world, but it influences their thinking. It helps them to understand, like, this is what this could look like if it were to happen in real life. And there's so many stories now that focus on death and grief and explaining this to children. Um, and, similarly with movies, if your child has a favorite movie and maybe someone has died in that movie, you can point that out. If you notice that there's a character that is sad because some aspect of loss is happening, you can say, "Oh, do you see that character? Well, they're going through loss. This is what happened. This is what's making them sad." That can help them to make those connections to the different emotions they're going to feel while they're grieving. Um, and then the final thing I would say with that is, be honest with them about your own grief journey. Perhaps, maybe grandma's death anniversary comes by or their birthday or you name it, and you're like, "You know what? I was thinking about grandma today. I
Hmm.
really miss her. My favorite thing that we ever did was, X, Y, and Z." And it teaches them that you can reflect on this and you can embrace those memories and that you can miss them, but it doesn't have to be a negative or, overwhelming experience to miss them. You can incorporate them in your day to day life.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. So, where can we find more information about you, Dr. Doc? Do you have a website, or is there anything you can provide for anyone who wants to find more information about the work that you do?
Absolutely. So you can find more about me on my website. It is www.elrisidoc.com. You can also check out the Home Funeral Alliance. I am the president there, and we lean into all aspects of community death care. So that's another thing to potentially explore if you want to look at different methods to have children involved in a funeral process and rituals and what that looks like.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Doc, for your time. I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.